In this video I want to take a basic look at urinalysis. And while I consider this a basic look, kind of a freshman, sophomore intro to nursing or pre-nursing student introduction, I do think it takes it beyond what most lab manuals at this level actually cover. And the reason is because I want to point out that it's not so much the individual tests that reveals something in urinalysis, it's the comparison of the tests that reveals something. So in urinalysis, it's a relatively non-invasive way to get hints at various pathologies, everything from things like hemolysis, liver disease, diabetes, hypertension, preeclampsia, biliary obstruction, things like that. You can get a hint at those just by comparing the results of the various tests. And at least our lab manual, it only covers each individual test and describes those and doesn't come back to the comparison of tests. So I will go through each test individually, but I also want to come back at the end and show you some demonstration urine sticks that I've kind of doctored up in order to show you how the comparison of the test can hint at certain disease states. Now the first thing I want to just show is the actual bottle, and I don't know if you can actually read it quite real well, but I'll actually narrate a little bit. This first line is a specific gravity, and what you're going to do is take your urine strip that you've dipped in urine, and you've just simply dipped it in there, and then you wait 60 seconds and then you read. One key is to make sure that you're lining up the strip handle so that you don't invert your readings. So you want to line up the strip handle. Everything underneath the strip handle is a normal value. So under there we've got specific gravity, we've got pH, we've got leukocytes or white blood cells, nitrites, protein, glucose, ketones, urobilinogen, bilirubin, blood, and you can also test for hemoglobin using the same exact pad. And the last little pad is the compensation area, and that just is for white balancing when this is read off automatically with machines. One thing I will point out before we get started though is you'll actually slide this last pad back and forth because the single pad is used to read blood or hemoglobin. We'll get to that in a second. So let's come up here and talk about the first one, specific gravity. Specific gravity is essentially how concentrated the urine is. If water has a specific gravity of about 1, then as you add things to it like electrolytes or urea, then the specific gravity goes up. So specific gravity is essentially a measure of how many electrolytes, how much urea is dissolved in the water of the urine. So higher specific gravities mean a more concentrated urine, lower specific gravities mean a more dilute urine. Specific gravities can be too high or too low, but generally they're right in the range of 1.005. So what I mean by that is if it's too low, that can indicate a pathology, or if it's too high, that can indicate a pathology. For specific gravities that are too low, that can be a sign of diabetes, and it could be diabetes insipidus or diabetes mellitus. In diabetes insipidus, the body fails to make antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, so water is lost in the urine since ADH normally stimulates water uptake in the collecting duct of the nephron in the kidney. In diabetes mellitus, there's excessive glucose in the blood, and that passes through the filtrate into the urine. It can't all be taken back up, and it generally will draw water with it by osmosis. So if there's excess glucose in the urine, there'll be excess water in the urine too, and that'll lower the specific gravity. If you take in too much water, so in excessive water intake, or certain renal diseases, kidney diseases, where you can't take up the water as well, that also will result in low specific gravity. Things that cause too high of a concentration of urine or a high specific gravity would be things like dehydration or anything that causes dehydration, like diarrhea, vomiting, water restriction, or excessive sweating. Another thing that can cause a high specific gravity is if the kidney is impaired somehow, or blood flow to the kidney is impaired, so that there's not enough fluid being provided to the kidney to provide filtration. Cases like heart failure or renal arterial stenosis, there's a lack of filtration, and so the urine is really concentrated because there's not enough of flow of dilute or blood or plasma to the kidneys in order to bring down that concentration. The next strip is basically pH, and that's just a measure of the acidity of the urine. Normally urine has a pH of around 5 to 6, but it might vary normally between 5 and 8. One of the biggest things that alters pH is diet. So as a diagnostic, pH is not real strong unless it consistently is high or consistently low. A cause of high pH may be due to things like kidney failure, where bicarbonate is not absorbed or hydrogen cannot be secreted into the urine, and that will also cause a high pH. A urinary tract infection is a cause of basic pH because there's certain bacteria that will break down urea, and urea is generally an acidic source in the urine, so if that's broken down by bacteria, it'll turn the urine basic. So if there's bacteria that are getting rid of the urea, that'll turn the urine basic, indicates a bacterial infection. Also, anything that causes respiratory alkalosis, like hyperventilation or anything that causes metabolic alkalosis like vomiting can also lead to a basic urine. Lastly, a vegetarian diet can make people's urine pH around 8. A low urine pH may be caused by respiratory acidosis. Like emphysema, there's a buildup of CO2, and that causes an acidification of the blood, and some of that acid will end up in the urine. Diarrhea also causes acidosis because the rapid flow through the GI prevents the absorption of bicarbonate. And bicarbonate is one of the body's main bases to balance out acid. So if it can't absorb that bicarbonate to balance acid, then the blood will turn acidic, and so will the urine. Anything that interferes with normal glucose metabolism will cause fats to be broken down into keto acids, and that'll also acidify the urine. So diabetes mellitus, or liver failure where there's not proper glucose generation, pancreatic failure where there's not proper insulin release, can all lead to acid in the urine. The next thing we have here is leukocytes, and leukocytes would show up as purple. Any kind of purple would indicate that there's white blood cells or leukocytes in the blood. Generally, that indicates a urinary tract infection, especially if that's combined with nitrates, which we'll do in a second, and then, as we said before, a basic pH. If there's not an associated increase in nitrates and basic pH, a UTI is still possible, but it might just indicate that the body is fighting an infection elsewhere in the body. Those leukocytes are being lysed in the battle, so to speak, and those products are ending up in the urine. So leukocytes could indicate urinary tract infection or some sort of infection in the body where white blood cells are being lysed. The next step down is nitrate. Any kind of pink color is an indication of nitrates. And where nitrates would come into the urine is nitrates are usually in the urine, and certain bacteria will convert nitrates to nitrites. And that's really the only way you can get nitrates in your urine. So if there's nitrates in your urine, it's an indication that there's bacterial infection or that there's bacteria in the urine. Specific bacteria would be like E. coli, Salmonella, Citrobacter, Proteus, and Klebsiella. Those are the types of bacteria that convert nitrate to nitrite, causing urine to have nitrate. So if you have nitrate, it indicates a urinary tract infection. The next one is protein, and you can get transient increases in protein in your urine, and that might result from standing on your feet too long, which will increase your blood pressure around your kidneys, exercise, pregnancy, or if you've had a large protein meal like a steak meal or hamburger or something like that, then protein can naturally be in your urine. Most of the time there shouldn't be any protein in your urine because the glomerular filtration membrane usually filters everything smaller than a protein, or at least the bigger proteins. Recurring elevations of protein could indicate an increased release of protein in the body, so there's something destroying cells releasing those proteins. That could be things like liver disease, lupus, cardiac insufficiency, things like that. There can also be protein in your urine. As I said before, the glomerular filtration membrane is supposed to filter everything smaller than a protein, but if there's damage to that membrane, the protein can pass through and end up in your urine. Now, kind of a technicality is not all protein gets filtered. Some of the smaller proteins do pass through the glomerular filtration membrane, but they usually get taken back up by the tubules. So if there's smaller proteins in the urine, and that can be actually measured, if there's smaller proteins in the urine but not larger proteins, it means these proteins are being filtered but they're not being taken up as they should, and so that indicates there's something wrong with the tubules of the kidney. Moving down to glucose, if the urine stick shows bright green, that's the presence of glucose in the urine. Now normally glucose actually passes through the filtration membrane, but the body doesn't want to lose that glucose, so it takes almost all of it back up, really all of it, in the proximal convoluted tubule. Glycosuria is when there is glucose in the blood, and that's usually a sign of diabetes mellitus. It could be anything else that causes breakdowns in glucose metabolism too, things like the liver disease and pancreatic disease. Usually high glucose is going to be accompanied by ketones too. I mentioned it briefly, but we'll just move on down and talk about ketones. Ketones are produced whenever fat has to be metabolized to produce glucose. And sometimes fat has to be metabolized to make glucose because essentially neurons and red blood cells need glucose. So in a triglycerol, which is a fat, you can actually take the glycerol and turn it into glucose, but the remaining fatty acids get turned into ketones. And those ketones are actually acidic. So anything in the body that causes the body to turn fat into glucose wastes those fatty acid chains and causes keto acids. Any of those things will cause ketones. You can also get ketones if you're on the Atkins diet or if anything else is causing a lack of glucose metabolism like fasting. Similarly, certain situations can cause high amounts of stress, and the release of cortisol, so burns and post-surgery and things like that, can increase fat metabolism, and that can also cause ketones to show up in the urine.